Chapter 14. The Ghost Ships. At 4 o'clock, when again we went on deck, the second mate told me to go on with a paunch mat I was making, while Tammy he sent to get out his sinnet. I had the mat slung on the fore side of the mainmast, between it and the after end of the house. And in a few minutes, Tammy brought his sinnet and yarns to the mast, and made fast to one of the pins. "What do you think it was, Jessup?" he asked abruptly after a short silence. I looked at him. "What do you think?" I replied. "I don't know what to think," he said, "but I've a feeling that it's something to do with all the rest," and he indicated aloft with his head. "I've been thinking too," I remarked. "That it is?" he inquired. "Yes," I answered, and told him how the idea had come to me at my dinner, that the strange men-shadows which came aboard might come from that indistinct vessel we had seen down in the sea. "Good Lord!" he exclaimed, as he got my meaning. And then for a little he stood and thought. "That's where they live, you mean?" he said at last, and paused again. "Well," I replied, "it can't be the sort of existence we should call life." He nodded doubtfully. "No," he said, and was silent again. Presently he put out an idea that had come to him. "You think, then, that vessel has been with us for some time, if we'd only known?" he asked. "All along," I replied. "I mean, ever since these things started." "Supposing there are others?" he said suddenly. I looked at him. "If there are," I said, "you can pray to God that they won't stumble across us. It strikes me that, whether they're ghosts or not ghosts, they're blood-gutted pirates." "It seems horrible," he said solemnly, "to be talking seriously like this, about, about such things." "I've tried to stop thinking that way," I told him. "I felt I should go cracked if I didn't. There's damned queer things happen at sea, I know, but this isn't one of them." "It seems so strange and unreal one moment, doesn't it?" he said. "And the next, you know it's really true, and you can't understand why you didn't always know. And yet they'd never believe if you told them ashore about it." "They'd believe if they'd been in this packet in the middle watch this morning," I said. "Besides," I went on, "they don't understand. We didn't. I shall always feel different now when I read that some packet hasn't been heard of." Tammy stared at me. "I've heard some of the old shellbacks talking about things," he said, "but I never took them really seriously." "Well," I said, "I guess we'll have to take this seriously. I wish to God we were home." "My God, so do I," he said. For a good while after that, we both worked on in silence, but presently he went off on another tack. "Do you think we'll really shorten her down every night before it gets dark?" he asked. "Certainly," I replied. "They'll never get the men to go aloft at night, after what's happened." But, supposing they ordered us aloft," he began. "Would you go?" I interrupted. "No," he said emphatically. "I'd jolly well be put in irons first." "That settles it, then," I replied. "You wouldn't go, nor would anyone else." At this moment the second mate came along. "Shove that mat and that sinnet away, you two," he said. "Then get your brooms and clear up." "Aye, aye, sir," we said, and he went on forward. "Jump on the house, Tammy," I said, "and let go the other end of this rope, will you?" "Right," he said, and did as I asked him. When he came back, I got him to give me a hand to roll up the mat, which was a very large one. "I'll finish stopping it," I said. "You go and put your sinnet away." "Wait a minute," he replied, and gathered up a double handful of shakens from the deck, under where I had been working. Then he ran to the side. "Here," I said, "don't go dumping those. They'll only float, and the second mate or the skipper will be sure to spot them." "Come here, Jessup," he interrupted in a low voice, and taking no notice of what I had been saying. I got up off the hatch where I was kneeling. He was staring over the side. "What's up?" I asked. "For God's sake, hurry," he said, and I ran and jumped onto the spar alongside of him. "Look," he said, and pointed with a handful of shakens right down directly beneath us. Some of the shakens dropped from his hand and blurred the water momentarily so that I could not see. Then, as the ripples cleared away, I saw what he meant. "2 of them," he said in a voice that was scarcely above a whisper. "And there's another out there." And he pointed again with a handful of shakens. "There's another a little further aft," I muttered. "Where? Where?" he asked. "There," I said, and pointed. "That's 4, he whispered. 4 of them." I said nothing, but continued to stare. They appeared to me to be a great way down in the sea, and quite motionless. Yet, though their outlines were somewhat blurred and indistinct, there was no mistaking that they were very like exact, though shadowy representations of vessels. For some minutes we watched them, without speaking. At last Tammy spoke. "They're real right enough," he said in a low voice. "I don't know," I answered. "I mean, we weren't mistaken this morning," he said. "No," I replied. "I never thought we were." Away forward, I heard the second mate returning aft. He came nearer and saw us. "What's up now, you two?" he called sharply. "This isn't clearing up." I put out my hand to warn him not to shout, and draw the attention of the rest of the men. He took several steps towards me. "What is it? What is it?" he said with a certain irritability, but in a lower voice. "You better take a look over the side, sir," I replied. My tone must have given him an inkling that we had discovered something fresh. For at my words he made one spring and stood on the spar alongside me. "Look, sir," said Tammy. "There's 4 of them." The second mate glanced down, saw something, and bent sharply forward. "My God," I heard him mutter under his breath. After that, for some half-minute he stared, without a word. "There are 2 more out there, sir," I told him, and indicated the place with my finger. It was a little time before he managed to locate these, and when he did, he gave them only a short glance. Then he got down off the spar and spoke to us. "Come down off there," he said quickly. "Get your brooms and clear up. Don't say a word. It may be nothing." He appeared to add that last bit as an afterthought, and we both knew it meant nothing. Then he turned and went swiftly aft. "I expect he's gone to tell the old man," Tammy remarked as we went forward, carrying the mat and his sinnet. I said, scarcely noticing what he was saying, for I was full of the thought of those 4 shadowy craft waiting quietly down there. We got our brooms and went aft. On the way, the second mate and the skipper passed us. They went forward too by the fore-brace and got up on the spar. I saw the second point up at the brace, and he appeared to be saying something about the gear. I guessed that this was done purposely to act as a blind, should any of the men be looking. Then the old man glanced down over the side in a casual sort of manner. So did the second mate. A minute or 2 later they came aft and went back up onto the poop. I caught a glimpse of the skipper's face as he passed me on his return. He struck me as looking worried. Bewildered, perhaps, would be a better word. Both Tammy and I were tremendously keen to have another look, but when at last we got a chance, the sky reflected so much on the water we could see nothing below. We had just finished sweeping up when 4 bells went and we cleared below for tea. Some of the men got chatting while they were grubbing. "I have heard," remarked Quoin, "as we're going to shorten her down afore dark." "Eh?" said old Jasket over his pannikin of tea. Quoin repeated his remark. "Who says so?" inquired Plummer. "I heard it from the dock," answered Quoin. "He got it from the steward." "How would he know?" asked Plummer. "I dunno," said Quoin. "I 'spect he's heard him talking about it arft." Plummer turned to me. "Have you heard anything, Jessup?" he inquired. "What, about shortening down?" I replied. "Yes," he said. "Weren't the old men talking to you up on their poop this morning?" "Yes," I answered. "He said something to the second mate about shortening down, but it wasn't to me." "They are," said Quoin. "Haven't I just said so?" At that instant one of the chaps in the other watch poked his head in through the starboard doorway. "All hands shorten sail," he sung out. At the same moment the mate's whistle came sharp along the decks. Plummer stood up and reached for his cap. "Well," he said, "it's evident they ain't going to lose no more of us." Then he went out on deck. It was a dead calm, but all the same we furled the 3 royals and then the 3 topgallants. After that we hauled up the main and foresail and stowed them. The crossjack, of course, had been furled some time, with the wind being plumb aft. It was while we were up at the foresail that the sun went over the edge of the horizon. We had finished stowing the sail out upon the yard, and I was waiting for the others to clear in, and let me get off the foot-rope. Thus it happened that, having nothing to do for nearly a minute, I stood watching the sunset, and so saw something that otherwise I should most probably have missed. The sun had dipped nearly halfway below the horizon and was showing like a great red dome of dull fire. Abruptly, far away on the starboard bow, a faint mist drove up out of the sea. It spread across the face of the sun so that its light shone now as though it came through a dim haze of smoke. Quickly this mist or haze grew thicker, but at the same time separating and taking strange shapes, so that the red of the sun struck through ruddily between them. Then, as I watched, the weird mistiness collected and shaped and rose into 3 towers. These became more definite, and there was something elongated beneath them. The shaping and forming continued, and almost suddenly I saw that the thing had taken on the shape of a great ship. Directly afterwards I saw that it was moving. It had been broadside to the sun. Now it was swinging. The bows came round with a stately movement until the 3 masts bore in a line. It was heading directly toward us. It grew larger, but yet less distinct. Astern of it, I saw now that the sun had sunk to a mere line of light. Then, in the gathering dusk, it seemed to me that the ship was sinking back into the ocean. The sun went beneath the sea, and the thing I had seen became merged, as it were, into the monotonous greyness of the coming night. A voice came to me from the rigging. It was the second mate's. He had been up to give us a hand. "Now then, Jessup," he was saying, "come along, come along." I turned quickly and realized that the fellows were nearly all off the yard. "Aye, aye, sir," I muttered, and slid in along the foot-rope and went down on deck. I felt fresh, dazed and frightened. A little later 8 bells went, and, after roll call, I cleared up onto the poop to relieve the wheel. For a while, as I stood at the wheel, my mind seemed blank, and incapable of receiving impressions. This sensation went after a time, and I realized that there was a great stillness over the sea. There was absolutely no wind, and even the everlasting creak of the gear seemed to ease off at times. At the wheel there was nothing whatever to do. I might just as well have been forward, smoking in the forecastle. Down on the main deck I could see the loom of the lanterns that had been lashed up to the sherpoles in the fore and main rigging. Yet they showed less than they might, owing to the fact that they had been shaded on their aftersides so as not to blind the officer of the watch more than need be. The night had come down strangely dark, and yet of the dark and the stillness and the lanterns I was only conscious in occasional flashes of comprehension. For now that my mind was working, I was thinking chiefly of that queer, vast phantom of mist I had seen rise from the sea and take shape. I kept staring into the night towards the west, and then all round me. For naturally the memory predominated that she had been coming towards us when the darkness came, and it was a pretty disquieting sort of thing to think about. I had such a horrible feeling that something beastly was going to happen any minute. Yet 2 bells came and went, and still all was quiet. Strangely quiet, it seemed to me. And, of course, besides the queer, misty vessel I had seen in the west, I was all the time remembering the 4 shadowy craft lying down in the sea, under our port side. Every time I remembered them, I felt thankful for the lanterns round the main deck, and I wondered why none had been put in the mizzen rigging. I wished to goodness that they had, and made up my mind I would speak to the second mate about it next time he came aft. At the time, he was leaning over the rail across the break of the poop. He was not smoking, as I could tell, for had he been, I should have seen the glow of his pipe now and then. It was plain to me that he was uneasy. 3 times already he had been down onto the main deck, prowling about. I guessed that he had been to look down into the sea for any signs of those 4 grim craft. I wondered whether they would be visible at night. Suddenly the timekeeper struck 3 bells, and the deeper notes of the bell forward answered them. I gave a start. It seemed to me that they had been struck close to my elbow. There was something unaccountably strange in the air that night. Then, even as the second mate answered the lookouts all well, there came the sharp whir and rattle of running gear on the port side of the mainmast. Simultaneously, there was the shrieking of a peril up the main, and I knew that someone, or something, had let go the main topsail halyards. From aloft there came the sound of something parting, then the crash of the yard as it ceased falling. The second mate shouted out something unintelligible and jumped for the ladder. From the main deck there came the sound of running feet and the voices of the watch shouting. Then I caught the skipper's voice. He must have run out on deck through the saloon doorway. "Get some more lamps! Get some more lamps!" he was singing out. Then he swore. He sung out something further. I caught the last 2 words. "Carried away," they sounded like. "No, sir," shouted the second mate. "I don't think so." A minute of some confusion followed, and then came the click of pawls. I could tell that they had taken the halyards to the after capstan. Odd words floated up to me. "All this water?" I heard in the old man's voice. He appeared to be asking a question. "Can't say, sir," came the second mate's. There was a period of time, filled only by the clicking of the pawls and the sounds of the creaking parrel and the running gear. Then the second mate's voice came again. "Seems all right, sir," I heard him say. I never heard the old man's reply, for in the same moment there came to me a chill of cold breath at my back. I turned sharply and saw something peering over the taffrail. It had eyes that reflected the binnacle light, weirdly, with a frightful tigerish gleam. But beyond that, I could see nothing with any distinctness. For the moment I just stared. I seemed frozen. It was so close. Then movement came to me, and I jumped to the binnacle and snatched out the lamp. I twitched round and shone the light towards it. The thing, whatever it was, had come more forward over the rail. But now, before the light, it recoiled with a queer, horrible litheness. It slid back and down, and so out of sight. I have only a confused notion of a wet glistening something with 2 vile eyes. Then I was running, crazy, towards the break of the poop. I sprang down the ladder and missed my footing and landed on my stern at the bottom. In my left hand I held the still burning binnacle lamp. The men were putting away the capstan bars, but at my abrupt appearance and the yell I gave out at falling, 1 or 2 of them fairly ran backwards a short distance in sheer funk before they realized what it was. From somewhere further forward, the old man and the second mate came running aft. "What the devil's up now?" sung out the second, stopping and bending to stare at me. "What's to do that you're away from the wheel?" I stood up and tried to answer him, but I was so shaken that I could only stammer. There, I stuttered. "Damnation!" shouted the second mate angrily. "Get back to the wheel!" I hesitated and tried to explain. "Do you damned well hear me?" he sung out. "Yes, sir, but—" I began. "Get up onto the poop, Jessup," he said. I went. I meant to explain when he came up. At the top of the ladder I stopped. I was not going back alone to that wheel. Down below I heard the old man speaking. "What on earth is it now, Mr. Tulipson?" he was saying. The second mate made no immediate reply, but turned to the men who were evidently crowding near. "That will do, men," he said somewhat sharply. I heard the watch start to go forward. There came a mutter of talk from them. Then the second mate answered the old man. He could not have known that I was near enough to overhear him. "It's Jessup, sir. He must have seen something, but we mustn't frighten the crowd more than need be." "No," said the skipper's voice. They turned and came up the ladder, and I ran back a few steps as far as the skylight. I heard the old man speak as they came up. "How is it there are no lamps, Mr. Tulipson?" he said in a surprised tone. "I thought there would be no need up here, sir," the second mate replied. Then he added something about saving oil. "Better have them, I think," I heard the skipper say. "Very good, sir," answered the second, and sung out to the timekeeper to bring up a couple of lamps. Then the two of them walked aft to where I stood by the skylight. "What are you doing away from the wheel?" asked the old man in a stern voice. I had collected my wits somewhat by now. "I won't go, sir, till there's a light," I said. The skipper stamped his foot angrily, but the second mate stepped forward. Come, Jessup," he exclaimed. "This won't do, you know. You'd better get back to the wheel without further bother." "Wait a minute," said the skipper at this juncture. "What objection have you to going back to the wheel?" he asked. "I saw something," I said. "It was climbing over the taffrail, sir." "Ah," he said, interrupting me with a quick gesture. Then abruptly, sit down. You're all in a shake, man." I flopped down on the skylight seat. I was, as he had said, all in a shake, and the binnacle lamp was wobbling in my hand, so that the light from it went dancing here and there across the deck. "Now," he went on, "just tell us what you saw." I told them at length, and while I was doing so, the timekeeper brought up the lights and lashed one up on the sheer pole in each rigging. "Shove one under the spanker boom," the old man sung out as the boy finished lashing up the other two. "Be smart now." "Aye, aye, sir," said the prentice, and hurried off. "Now then," remarked the skipper when this had been done, "you needn't be afraid to go back to the wheel. There's a light over the stern, and the second mate or myself will be up here all the time." I stood up. "Thank you, sir," I said, and went aft. I replaced my lamp in the binnacle and took hold of the wheel. Yet, time and again, I glanced behind, and I was very thankful when, a few minutes later, 4 bells went and I was relieved. Though the rest of the chaps were forward in the forecastle, I did not go there. I shirked being questioned about my sudden appearance at the foot of the poop ladder, so I lit my pipe and wandered about the main deck. I did not feel particularly nervous, as there were now 2 lanterns in each rigging, and a couple standing upon each of the spare topmasts under the bulwarks. Yet, a little after 5 bells, it seemed to me that I saw a shadowy face peer over the rail, a little abaft of the 4 lanyards. I snatched up one of the lanterns from off the spar and flashed the light towards it, whereupon there was nothing. Only, on my mind, more than my sight, I fancy, a queer knowledge remained of wet, peery eyes. Afterwards, when I thought about them, I felt extra beastly. I knew then how brutal they had been. Inscrutable, you know. Once more in that same watch, I had a somewhat similar experience, only in this instance it had vanished even before I had time to reach a light. And then came 8 bells, and our watch below. End of chapter 14. Chapter 15. The Great Ghost Ship. When we were called again, at 4:15, the man who roused us out had some queer information. "Toppin's gone. Clean vanished," he told us, as we began to turn out. "I never was in such a damned hair-raisin' hooker as this here. It ain't safe to go about the bloomin' decks." "Who's gone?" asked Plummer, sitting up suddenly and throwing his legs over his bunk-board. "Toppin, one of the 'prentices," replied the man. "We've been hunting all over the bloomin' show. We're still at it, but we'll never find him," he ended, with a sort of gloomy assurance. "Oh, I dunno," said Quoin. "Perhaps he's snoozin' somewheres about." "Not him," replied the man. "I tell you, we've turned everything upside down. He's not aboard the bloomin' ship." "Where was he when they last saw him?" I asked. "Someone must know something, you know." "Keepin' time up on the poop," he replied. "The old man's nearly shook the life out of the mate and the chap at the wheel, and they say they don't know nothin'." "How do you mean?" I inquired. "How do you mean, nothing?" "Well," he answered, "the youngster was there one minute, and the next thing they knew, he'd gone. They've both sworn black and blue that there wasn't a whisper. He's just disappeared off the face of the bloomin' earth." I got down onto my chest and reached for my boots. Before I could speak again, the man was saying something fresh. "See here, mates," he went on. "If things is goin' on like this, I'd like to know where you and me'll be before long." "We'll be in hell," said Plummer. "I dunno as I like to think about it," said Quoin. "We'll have to think about it," replied the man. "We've got to think a bloomin' lot about it. I've talked to our side, and they're game." "Game for what?" I asked. "To go and talk straight to the bloomin' captain," he said, wagging his finger at me. "It's make tracks for the nearest bloomin' port, and don't you make no bloomin' mistake." I opened my mouth to tell him that the probability was we should not be able to make it, even if he could get the old man to see the matter from his point of view. Then I remembered that the chap had no idea of the things I had seen and thought out. So instead I said, "Supposing he won't?" "Then we'll have to bloomin' well make him," he replied. "And when you got there," I said, "what then? You'd be jolly well locked up for mutiny." "I'd sooner be locked up," he said. "It don't kill you." There was a murmur of agreement from the others, and then a moment of silence, in which I know the men were thinking. Jaskett's voice broke into it. "I never thought at first as she was 'aunted," he commented, but Plummer cut in across his speech. "We mustn't hurt anyone, you know," he said. "That'd mean hangin', and they ain't been a bad crowd." "No," assented everyone, including the chap who had come to call us. "All the same," he added, "it's got to be up Pelham, and shove her into the nearest bloomin' port." "Yes," said everyone. Then 8 bells went, and we cleared out on deck. Presently, after roll call, in which there had come a queer, awkward little pause at Toppin's name, Tammy came over to me. The rest of the men had gone forward, and I guessed they were talking over mad plans for forcing the skipper's hand and making him put into port. Poor beggars. I was leaning over the port rail, by the fore bracelock, staring down into the sea, when Tammy came to me. For perhaps a minute he said nothing. When at last he spoke, it was to say that the shadow vessels had not been there since daylight. "What?" I said in some surprise. "How do you know?" "I woke up when they were searching for Toppin," he replied. "I've not been asleep since. I came here right away." He began to say something further, but stopped short. "Yes?" I said encouragingly. "I didn't know—" he began and broke off. He caught my arm. "Oh, Jessup," he exclaimed, "what's going to be the end of it all? Surely something can be done." I said nothing. I had a desperate feeling that there was very little we could do to help ourselves. "Can't we do something?" he asked and shook my arm. "Anything's better than this. We're being murdered." Still I said nothing, but stared moodily down into the water. I could plan nothing, though I would get mad, feverish fits of thinking. "Do you hear?" he said. He was almost crying. "Yes, Tammy," I replied, "but I don't know. I don't know." "You don't know?" he exclaimed. "You don't know? Do you mean we're just to give in and be murdered, one after another?" "We've done all we can," I replied. "I don't know what else we can do, unless we go below and lock ourselves in every night." "That would be better than this," he said. "There'll be no one to go below, or anything else soon." "But what if it came on to blow?" I asked. "We'd be having the sticks blown out of her." "What if it came on to blow now?" he returned. "No one would go aloft. If it were dark, you said yourself. Besides, we could shorten her right down, first. I tell you, in a few days there won't be a chap alive aboard this packet unless they jolly well do something." "Don't shout," I warned him. "You'll have the old man hearing you." But the young beggar was wound up and would take no notice. "I will shout," he replied. "I want the old man to hear. I've a good mind to go up and tell him." He started on a fresh tack. "Why don't the men do something?" he began. "They ought to damn well make the old man put us into port. They ought—" "For goodness sake, shut up, you little fool," I said. "What's the good of talking a lot of damned rot like that? You'll be getting yourself into trouble." "I don't care," he replied. "I'm not going to be murdered." "Look here," I said. "I told you before that we shouldn't be able to see the land even if we made it." "You've no proof," he answered. "It's only your idea." "Well," I replied, "proof or no proof, the skipper would only pile her up if he tried to make the land, with things as they are now." "Let him pile her up," he answered. "Let him jolly well pile her up. That would be better than staying out here to be pulled overboard or chucked down from aloft." "Look here, Tammy," I began, but just then the second mate sung out for him and he had to go. When he came back, I had started to walk to and from across the fore side of the mainmast. He joined me, and after a minute he started his wild talk again. "Look here, Tammy," I said once more. "It's no use your talking like you've been doing. Things are as they are, and it's no one's fault, and nobody can help it. If you want to talk sensibly, I'll listen. If not, then go and gas to someone else." With that, I returned to the port side and got up on the spar again, intending to sit on the pinrail and have a bit of a talk with him. Before sitting down, I glanced over into the sea. The action had been almost mechanical. Yet, after a few instants, I was in a state of the most intense excitement, and without withdrawing my gaze, I reached out and caught Tammy's arm to attract his attention. "My God," I muttered. "Look." "What is it?" he asked, and bent over the rail beside me. And this is what we saw. A little distance below the surface there lay a pale-colored, slightly domed disk. It seemed only a few feet down. Below it we saw quite clearly, after a few moments' staring, the shadow of a royal yard, and deeper the gear and standing rigging of a great mast. Far down among the shadows, I thought presently that I could make out the immense, indefinite stretch of vast decks. "My God!" whispered Tammy, and shut up. But presently he gave out a short exclamation, as though an idea had come to him, and got down off the spar and ran forward onto the forecastle head. He came running back after a short look into the sea to tell me that there was the truck of another great mast coming up there, a bit off the bow to within a few feet of the surface of the sea. In the meantime, you know, I had been staring like mad down through the water at the huge, shadowy mast just below me. I had traced out bit by bit until now I could clearly see the jackstay running along the top of the royal mast. And, you know, the royal itself was set. But, you know, what was getting at me more than anything was a feeling that there was movement down in the water there among the rigging. I thought I could actually see, at times, things moving and glinting faintly and rapidly to and fro in the gear. And once I was practically certain that something was on the royal yard, moving into the mast, as though, it might have come up the leach of the sail. And this way I got a beastly feeling that there were things swarming down there. Unconsciously, I must have leant further and further out over the side, staring. And suddenly, good Lord, how I yelled. I overbalanced. I made a sweeping grab and caught the forebrace, and with that I was back in a moment upon the spar. In the same second almost, it seemed to me that the surface of the water above the submerged truck was broken, and I am sure now I saw something a moment in the air against the ship's side, a sort of shadow in the air, though I did not realize it at the time. Anyway, the next instant, Tammy gave out an awful scream and was head downwards over the rail in a second. I had an idea then that he was jumping overboard. I collared him by the waist of his breeches and one knee, and then I had him down on the deck and sat plump on him, for he was struggling and shouting all the time, and I was so breathless and shaken and gone to mush I could not have trusted my hands to hold him. You see, I never thought then it was anything but some influence at work on him, and that he was trying to get loose to go over the side. But I know now that I saw the shadow man that had him. Only at the time I was so mixed up, and with the one idea in my head, I was not really able to notice anything properly. But afterwards, I comprehended a bit, you can understand, can't you, what I had seen at the time without taking in. And even now, looking back, I know that the shadow was only like a faint seen grayness in the daylight, against the whiteness of the decks, clinging against Tammy. And there was I, all breathless and sweating and quivering with my own tumble, sitting on the little screeching beggar, and he fighting like a mad thing, so that I thought I should never hold him. And then I heard the second mate shouting, and there came running feet along the deck. Then many hands were pulling and hauling to get me off him. "Blooding coward!" sung out someone. Hold him! I shouted. "He'll be overboard!" At that they seemed to understand that I was not ill-treating the youngster, for they stopped manhandling me and allowed me to rise, while two of them took hold of Tammy and kept him safe. "What's the matter with him?" the second mate was singing out. "What's happened?" "He's gone off his head, I think," I said. "What?" asked the second mate. But before I could answer him, Tammy ceased suddenly to struggle and flopped down upon the deck. "He's fainted," said Plummer with some sympathy. He looked at me with a puzzled, suspicious air. "What's happened? What's he been doing?" "Take him aft into the berth," ordered the second mate a bit abruptly. It struck me that he wished to prevent questions. He must have tumbled to the fact that we had seen something, about which it would be better not to tell the crowd. Plummer stooped to lift the boy. "No," said the second mate. "Not you, Plummer. Jessup, you take him." He turned to the rest of the men. "That will do," he told them, and they went forward, muttering a little. I lifted the boy and carried him aft. "No need to take him into the berth," said the second mate. "Put him down on the after hatch. I've sent the other lad for some brandy." Then the brandy came, we dosed Tammy, and soon brought him round. He sat up with a somewhat dazed air. Otherwise, he seemed quiet and sane enough. "What's up?" he asked. He caught sight of the second mate. "Have I been ill, sir?" he exclaimed. "You're right enough now, youngster," said the second mate. "You've been a bit off. You'd better go and lie down for a bit." "I'm all right now, sir," replied Tammy. "I don't think—" "You do as you're told," interrupted the second. "Don't always have to be told twice. If I want you, I'll send for you." Tammy stood up and made his way, in rather an unsteady fashion, into the berth. I fancy he was glad enough to lie down. "Now then, Jessup, exclaimed the second mate, turning to me. "What's been the cause of all this? Out with it now, smart." I commenced to tell him, but almost directly he put up his hand. "Hold on a minute," he said. "There's the breeze." He jumped up the port ladder and sung out to the chap at the wheel, then down again. "Starboard fore brace," he sung out. He turned to me. "You'll have to finish telling me afterwards," he said. "Aye, aye, sir," I replied, and went to join the other chaps at the braces. As soon as we were braced sharp up on the port tack, he sent some of the watch up to loose the sails. Then he sung out for me. "Go on with your yarn now, Jessup," he said. I told him about the great shadow vessel, and I said something about Tammy. I mean, about my not being sure now whether he had tried to jump overboard. Because, you see, I began to realize that I had seen the shadow. I remembered the stirring of the water above the submerged truck. But the second did not wait, of course, for any theories, but was away like a shot to see for himself. He ran to the side and looked down. I followed and stood beside him. Yet, now that the surface of the water was blurred by the wind, we could see nothing. "It's no good," he remarked after a minute. "You better get away from the rail before any of the others see you. Just be taking those halyards aft to the capstan." From then until 8 bells we were hard at work getting the sail upon her, and when at last 8 bells went, I made haste to swallow my breakfast and get asleep. At midday, when we went on deck for the afternoon watch, I ran to the side. But there was no sign of the great shadow ship. All that watch the second mate kept me working at my paunch mat, and Tammy he put on to his sinnet, telling me to keep an eye on the youngster. But the boy was right enough, as I scarcely doubted now, you know, though a most unusual thing, he hardly opened his lips the whole afternoon. Then at 4 o'clock we went below for tea. At 4 bells, when we came on deck again, I found that the light breeze, which had kept us going during the day, had dropped, and we were only just moving. The sun was low down and the sky clear. Once or twice I glanced across to the horizon. It seemed to me that I caught again that odd quiver in the air that had preceded the coming of the mist. And indeed, on 2 separate occasions I saw a thin wisp of haze drive up, apparently out of the sea. This was at some little distance on our port beam. Otherwise, all was quiet and peaceful, and though I stared into the water, I could make out no vestige of that great shadow ship down in the sea. It was some little time after 6 bells that the order came for all hands to shorten sail for the night. We took in the royals and the topgallants, and then the 3 courses. It was shortly after this that a rumor went round the ship that there was to be no lookout that night after 8 o'clock. This naturally created a good deal of talk among the men, especially as the yarn went that the forecastle doors were to be shut and fastened as soon as it was dark, and that no one was to be allowed on deck. "Who's going to take the wheel?" I heard Plummer ask. "I suppose they'll have us take 'em as usual," replied one of the men. "One of their officers is bound to be on the poop, so we'll have company." Apart from these remarks, there was a general opinion that, if it were true, it was a sensible act on the part of the skipper. As one of the men said, "It ain't likely that there'll be any of us missin' in the morning if we stays in our bunks all the blessed night." And soon after this, 8 bells went. End of chapter 15. Chapter 16. The Ghost Pirates. At the moment when 8 bells actually went, I was in the forecastle, talking to 4 of the other watch. Suddenly, away aft, I heard shouting, and then on the deck overhead came the loud thudding of someone pumping with a capstan bar. Straightway I turned and made a run for the port doorway, along with the 4 other men. We rushed out through the doorway onto the deck. It was getting dusk, but that did not hide from me a terrible and extraordinary sight. All along the port rail there was a queer, undulating greyness, that moved downwards inboard and spread over the decks. As I looked, I found that I saw more clearly in a most extraordinary way. And suddenly all the moving greyness resolved into hundreds of strange men. In the half-light, they looked unreal and impossible, as though there had come upon us the inhabitants of some fantastic dream world. My God, I thought I was mad. They swarmed in upon us in a great wave of murderous, living shadows. From some of the men who must have been going aft for roll call, there rose into the evening air a loud, awful shouting. "Aloft!" yelled someone, but as I looked aloft, I saw that the horrible things were swarming there in scores and scores. "Jesus Christ!" shrieked a man's voice, cut short, and my glance dropped from aloft to find two of the men who had come out from the forecastle with me, rolling upon the deck. They were two indistinguishable masses that writhed here and there across the planks. The brutes fairly covered them. From them came muffled little shrieks and gasps, and there I stood, and with me were the other two men. A man darted past me into the forecastle, with two grey men on his back, and I heard them kill him. The two men by me ran suddenly across the forehatch, and up the starboard ladder onto the forecastle head. Yet, almost in the same instant, I saw several of the grey men disappear up the other ladder. From the forecastle head above, I heard the two men commence to shout, and this died away into a loud scuffling. At that, I turned to see whether I could get away. I stared round, hopelessly. And then, with two jumps, I was on the pigsty, and from there upon the top of the deck-house. I threw myself flat and waited breathlessly. All at once, it seemed to me that it was darker than it had been the previous moment, and I raised my head very cautiously. I saw that the ship was enveloped in great billows of mist, and then, not 6 feet from me, I made out someone lying face downwards. It was Tammy. I felt safer now that we were hidden by the mist, and I crawled to him. He gave a quick gasp of terror when I touched him, but when he saw who it was, he started to sob like a little kid. "Hush," I said. "For God's sake, be quiet." But I need not have troubled, for the shrieks of the men being killed down on the decks all around us drowned every other sound. I knelt up and glanced round and then aloft. Overhead I could make out dimly the spars and sails, and now as I looked I saw that the topgallants and royals had been unloosed and were hanging in the buntlines. Almost in the same moment the terrible crying of the poor beggars about the decks ceased, and there succeeded an awful silence, in which I could distinctly hear Tammy sobbing. I reached out and shook him. "Be quiet! Be quiet!" I whispered intensely. "They'll hear us." At my touch and whisper, he struggled to become silent, and then, overhead, I saw the 6 yards being swiftly mast-headed. Scarcely were the sails set when I heard the swish and flick of gaskets being cast adrift on the lower yards, and realized that ghostly things were at work there. For a moment or so there was silence, and I made my way cautiously to the after end of the house, and peered over. Yet, because of the mist, I could see nothing. Then, abruptly, from behind me, came a single wail of sudden pain and terror from Tammy. It ended instantly in a sort of choke. I stood up in the mist and ran back to where I had left the kid, but he had gone. I stood dazed. I felt like shrieking out loud. Above me I heard the flaps of the course being tumbled off the yards. Down upon the decks there were the noises of a multitude working in a weird, inhuman silence. Then came the squeal and rattle of blocks and braces aloft. They were squaring the yards. I remained standing. I watched the yards squared, and then I saw the sails fill suddenly. An instant later, the deck of the house upon which I stood became canted forward. The slope increased, so that I could scarcely stand, and I grabbed at one of the wire winches. I wondered, in a stunned sort of way, what was happening. Almost directly afterwards, from the deck on the port side of the house, there came a sudden, loud, human scream. And immediately, from different parts of the decks, there rose, afresh, some most horrible shouts of agony from odd men. These grew into an intense screaming that shook my heart up, and there came again a noise of desperate, brief fighting. Then a breath of cold wind seemed to play in the mist, and I could see down the slope of the deck. I looked below me, towards the bows. The jibboom was plunged right into the water, and, as I stared, the bows disappeared into the sea. The deck of the house became a wall to me, and I was swinging from the winch, which was now above my head. I watched the ocean lap over the edge of the forecastle head and rush down onto the main deck, roaring into the empty forecastle. And still, all around me, came crying of the lost sailormen. I heard something strike the corner of the house above me, with a dull thud, and then I saw Plummer plunge down into the flood beneath. I remembered that he had been at the wheel. The next instant, the water had leapt to my feet. There came a drear chorus of bubbly screams, a roar of waters, and I was going swiftly down into the darkness. I let go of the winch and struck out madly, trying to hold my breath. There was a loud singing in my ears. It grew louder. I opened my mouth. I felt I was dying. And then, thank God, I was at the surface breathing. For the moment, I was blinded with the water, in my agony of breathlessness. Then, growing easier, I brushed the water from my eyes, and so, not 300 yards away, I made out a large ship, floating almost motionless. At first, I could scarcely believe I saw aright. Then, as I realized that indeed there was yet a chance of living, I started to swim towards you. You know the rest. "And you think—" said the captain interrogatively, and stopped short. "No," replied Jessup, "I don't think. I know. None of us think. It's a gospel fact. People talk about queer things happening at sea, but this isn't one of them. This is one of the real things. You've all seen queer things, perhaps more than I have. It depends. But they don't go down in the log. These kinds of things never do. This one won't. At least, not as it's really happened." He nodded his head slowly and went on, addressing the captain more particularly. "I'll bet," he said deliberately, "that you'll enter it in the logbook something like this. May 18th, latitude south, longitude west, 2 p.m., light winds from the south and east. Sighted a full-rigged ship on the starboard bow. Overhauled her in the first dog-watch. Signaled her, but received no response. During the second dog-watch, she steadily refused to communicate. About 8 bells, it was observed that she seemed to be settling by the head, and a minute later she foundered suddenly, bows foremost, with all her crew. Put out a boat and picked up one of the men, an A.B. by the name of Jessup. He was quite unable to give any explanation of the catastrophe. And you two," he made a gesture at the first and second mates, "will probably sign your names to it, and so will I, and perhaps one of your A.B.s. Then when we get home they'll print a report of it in the newspapers, and people will talk about the unseaworthy ships. Maybe some of the experts will talk rot about rivets and defective plates and so forth." He laughed cynically, then he went on. "And, you know, when you come to think of it, there's no one except our own selves will ever know how it happened, really. The shellbacks don't count. They're only beastly, drunken brutes of common sailors, poor devils. No one would think of taking anything they said as anything more than a damned cuffer. Besides, the beggars only tell these things when they're half boozed. They wouldn't then, for fear of being laughed at, only they're not responsible." He broke off and looked round at us. The skipper and the 2 mates nodded their heads in silent assent. Appendix: The Silent Ship. I'm the third mate of the Sangier, the vessel that picked up Jessup, you know. He's asked us to write a short note of what we saw from our side and sign it. The old man set me on the job, as he says I can put it better than he can. Well, it was in the first dog watch that we came up with her, the Mort Cestus, I mean. It was in the second dog watch that it happened. The mate and I were on the poop watching her. You see, we'd signaled her, and she'd not taken any notice, and that seemed queer, as we couldn't have been more than 300 or 400 yards off her port beam, and it was a fine evening, so that we could have almost had a tea fight if they'd seemed a pleasant crowd. As it was, we called them a set of sulky swine and left it at that, though we still kept our hoist up. All the same, you know, we watched her a lot, and I remembered even then I thought it queer how quiet she was. We couldn't even hear her bell go, and I spoke to the mate about it, and he said he'd been noticing the same thing. Then, about 6 bells, they shortened her right down to topsails. And I can tell you, that made us stare more than ever, as anyone can imagine. And I remember we noticed then especially that we couldn't hear a single sound from her, even when the halyards were let go. And, you know, without the glass, I saw their old man singing out something, and we didn't get a sound of it, and we should have been able to hear every word. Then, just before 8 bells, the thing Jessup's told us about happened. Both the mate and the old man said they could see men going up her side a bit indistinct, you know, because it was getting dusk. But the second mate and I half thought we did and half thought we didn't. But there was something queer. We all knew that, and it looked like a sort of moving mist along her side. I know I felt pretty funny, but it wasn't the sort of thing, of course, to be sure and serious about until you were sure. After the mate and the captain had said they saw the men boarding her, we began to hear sounds from her, very queer at first, and rather like a phonograph makes when it's getting up speed. Then the sounds came properly from her, and we heard them shouting and yelling, and, you know, I don't know even now just what I really thought. It was all so queer and mixed. The next thing I remember, there was a thick mist round the ship, and then all the noise was shut off, as if it were all the other side of a door. But we could still see her masts and spars and sails above the misty stuff. And both the captain and the mate said they could see me aloft, and I thought I could, but the second mate wasn't sure. All the same, though, the sails were all loosed in about a minute, it seemed, and the yards mast-headed. We couldn't see the courses above the mist, but Jessup says they were loose too and sheeted home along the upper sails. Then we saw the yards squared, and I saw the sails fill bang up with wind. And yet, you know, ours were slatting. The next thing was the one that hit me more than anything. Her mast took a cant forward, and then I saw her stern come up out of the mist that was round her. Then, all in an instant, we could hear sounds from the vessel again. And I tell you, the men didn't seem to be shouting, but screaming. Her stern went higher. It was most extraordinary to look at. And then she went plunk down, head foremost, right bang into the mist stuff. It's all right what Jessup says, and when we saw him swimming, I was the one who spotted him, we got out a boat quicker than a windjammer ever got out a boat before, I should think. The captain and the mate and the second and I are all going to sign this. Signed, William Nauston, Master. J.E.G. Adams, First Mate. Ed Brown, Second Mate. Jack T. Evan, Third Mate. The End of The Ghost Pirates by William Hope Hodgson.